So good afternoon. I am Ento Budiarjo. Welcome to Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern to try and figure out what the future is for smart buildings. The list of this group is on mondaylive.org. Reminder that the views expressed on this show is personal, not of any company or organizations. Please do post questions and comments and chats on the Zoom tools. I think you all know how to do that by now. And complete the survey at the end, that would be great. And if you want any of the links that we've actually put on this slide deck, this slide deck is actually on mondaylive.org as well. So just as a reminder, this month, this is the last week where we're going to be talking about digital twins. This is the last week that we're going to be talking about digital twin as a theme of this month. I'm sure we'll be talking about digital twins beyond. The agenda for today, a normal chit chat, and really the main part is having had the discussion on digital twins. How should we think about positioning smart buildings with regards to digital twins? So that's really the question that we're going to pose to ourselves. We also have a couple of great guests joining us, Glenn Almendinger and Scott Ellison, so that'll be a really good conversation. Before that, a few slides. Roger has put up a slide about acquisitions, meaning company acquisitions, M&A. So we'll get into that in a minute. John Petsy is talking about greenwashing. Continue to do that, so we'll dig into that. Mark is going to be highlighting Haystack Connect, so that'll be great. That's actually next week. No, not next week. Is it next week or the week after?
Next week.
Next week. Wow. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. There's also another security symposium that I think we've all been hearing about. Mark will talk about that as well. My attention over the past couple of days is really about this kind of scary sort of scenario in India and in Japan. We're not out of the woods yet with regards to COVID, and I'm not sure much can be said about this, but it's quite concerning. Just before we jump into discussions and chit chat, next month, having had a few months now, we've talked about big subjects such as digital twins, sustainability, workforce, and various other things. We really have a situation where we have some new market dynamics going on in our industry. So we want to spend May talking about that, not really about the technology side, but really what does it mean to the business side of our industry? What does it mean to route to markets, go to markets, strategies, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So that will be an interesting thing that will start next week. So this is next week's, next week is the start of the May theme. So with that, I'm going to, who wants to start here? How about you, Roger? Start with you.
Yeah, sure. A couple of things there. One was Asia Pacific. I think a few weeks back, I actually showed you some charts that showed how the sentiment was going there, where virtually everywhere across the Asia Pacific it was all positive. Well, guess what? It's turned around, unfortunately, and it's saying that the sentiment's kind of turned down. The kind of flexible office space has remained sort of okay, but it's now the rest of it is beginning to deteriorate a little. So bear in mind they're a little bit ahead of the curve of us with what's happened in the marketplace with regards to COVID. That's one to watch to see how they progress out there with their commercial offices and leasing. The other one was just a report by Memori, which is actually recorded a record 58 acquisitions in the smart building space, which I thought was really interesting, because I think there's a huge amount of activity and seems to be a lot of money sloshing around in investments at the moment. But I think the thing that came out of it for me was that every one of those investments and acquisitions are all soft services or software. There's no kind of, building solutions, BMS, hardware, or anything else like that. It's all the soft services that kind of sit around, the data that's available. And when I look at the people who are actually sat here on the screen, guess what? They're in a similar sort of marketplace. So it's an interesting trait of what's going on. And I just wonder how much focus there will be on that kind of edge and the site sort of hardware side of things in future, because the glory is in the data and the software.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, Roger, because I read the same report and came to the same conclusion. Like, it was all software, there was no hardware-based acquisitions going on, which was interesting, as you mentioned.
John.
Yeah, sure. So, brought up the topic, I think, a few times about, greenwashing or, ESG theater and whatever. So two things were interesting. One, on the right-hand side of that slide there, you have a lot of announcements. One of the newsletters I get, all of a sudden, there are many more announcements from companies with their commitments. So I think there's weight behind that, even if they're all talking different levels of seriousness and what they're going to do. And in fact, that's what the interesting article from GreenViz was. He was, in an odd way, coming to the benefit of the people who might be confused to greenwashing. And one of the things, his insights was that organizations who are doing useful things are getting accused of greenwashing because people don't think they're going far enough. Okay, they're not going far enough, fine. That's not the same thing as saying what they're doing isn't valuable, what they're doing isn't helping, right? And he was trying to make that distinction and kind of bring people back, I would say a little more to reality, because there are week by week corporate commitments towards greater, energy efficiency, sustainability, awareness, and taking action. And they shouldn't be all lumped together because just, it's not enough, not fast enough, whatever, So that's what that slide was for. I thought the two things kind of joined together well, right? From a lot of announcements and then this criticism on greenwashing. So.
Thank you. Mark, if your audio is working.
I'm coming in via phone. Can you hear me? Great. Okay.
Yep.
So what's interesting is the way we continue to do business and the way we exchange information and get more knowledge and get familiar with a lot of things. There still continues to be events and, mostly virtual. So I just wanted to remind everybody about the Haystack event coming up. If you're want to know anything about data, I think it's important that you log in and at least attend some of the sessions. We got some really, really good sessions. As of last week, there were in excess of 500 people who have registered, and it costs nothing to attend. So again, many of the folks on this panel, Anto, John, myself, will be presenting some key points. And then the second one was this whole idea about cybersecurity still, is something that we need to face and tackle each and every day. And this one that I put up on the link, what I liked about it, which is different, it's not a bunch of folks sitting here and telling you, secure your network, do this, do that. Yeah, we've heard it, we've heard it, we've heard it. It's more about real life situations, and the information and the data is presented in real life use cases with quasi actors and pretending they are building owners and operators, of which I was one. And in my particular case, I dealt with a printer that really caused havoc in a building. And there's some other really good ones there. So again, it's also free, I believe. So if you're cybersecurity, take a look at it, because the way it's being delivered is completely different. And hats off to Fred Gordy at Intelligent Buildings for doing that.
It goes on for 4 hours. I see that should be quite good on Wednesday. Great. So, any other sort of news or trend stuff that any of us want to talk about? Didn't go on a slide before we move on to the main topic of the day.
I'm just curious on the statistics out in the Far East of the COVID going up so significantly. Is it any explanation? Is it related to new variants of the virus? Anybody know? Because, you know, we're making a lot of progress with vaccine usage here in this country. So
That's a good question. Why now all of a sudden?
yeah, why now all of a sudden? Because when that graph showed that India had basically come way down, was stable, and all of a sudden they're shooting up dramatically. Why?
I think Modi sort of opened up the restrictions too early, is the comments that I've heard. I'm not quite sure about Japan, but that's the case for India. Nearly 400,000 new cases today. It's frightening.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. But then they got a huge population too. So
Well, I was going to say, having lived there for for a short while, but and visited quite a lot, you'd wonder why it hasn't happened earlier. The density and the challenge of trying to separate people, I just don't see how they could do social distancing. It's just not in their DNA, and I would just struggle to see how they'd even control it or deploy it. It's just for me, for India, as I'm surprised it hasn't happened before. It's not like in China where when it happened there, basically if you left your house, there were guards on the street to send you back to it, so it's a slightly different mentality.
Yeah, Japan is kind of worrying because I'm not quite sure what the driver is there, because they've been very, very controlled.
yeah, they've been wearing masks as well. Okay.
Okay, so let us move on. I'm going to bring on Glenn and Scott. Where are you, Scott? There you go. There you go. Hello, Glenn.
Hi, everybody.
Scott will join us in a moment. So the sort of the question, just if I can sort of set this up, of today is that we spent the month talking about digital twins, different aspects of it. Some of you may have seen either the show live or recorded. And sort of the question that we're asking ourselves, and we hope that Glenn and Scott, you can help us in this sort of answering this, is what does this mean? We've seen lots of trends, we've seen lots of hype things, we've seen IoT, M2M, a whole bunch of sort of other terms, and smart building just sort of continues doing its stuff, struggling to really sort of make its mark. So what are we to make of digital twins, and how should we change? And Glenn, maybe if I can ask you to chime in your thoughts and maybe introduce yourself briefly, and then we'll get to Scott to do the same.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Glenn Almendinger. I run a research and consulting firm that focuses on connected stuff, things, systems, hardware research. The staying power of all of these technologies is, I think, I guess maybe the easiest way to frame this is, whether the building space moves faster or slower than other spaces on, embracing digital twins and the ability to virtually optimize lots of different processes and equipment and systems and so forth. I think there's a certain inevitability to all of this, just kind of a question of whether it's leading or following. And so in some respects, I could see like healthcare or higher mission criticality kinds of segments respond to this in a little bit more deliberate way than traditional sort of mainstream commercial real estate. But I've always reminded people that eventually, I think once people kind of get accustomed to using data and analytics and modeling things and understanding the value of all that, I think almost all businesses out there are going to discover that quite a bit of the data that they require in order to do all the things they want to do will come from outside their business. They won't be in control of all the data that allows these systems to be enabled and informed. And And so as this shift occurs and people begin to understand the value of sharing data or brokering or, repositories or other data management techniques, I think, as I said, I think there's a certain inevitability. I think it will all be pretty much driven by particular segments and not the industry as a whole. And I think it will probably, my guess is buildings have always lagged the rest of the world in terms of its adoption of these technologies. And it's not that far along, I guess, in my view, as, along a maturity curve as it relates to sharing and brokering and leveraging that. But maybe Paystack and all of this tells and portends a different future. But I think it will be selective.
Thank you. Scott, it's really great to have you with us today on Monday Live. If you could introduce yourself and give us your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I certainly don't have the august background that I know a number of the panelists and participants have in this space. I noticed John Petsy up there, and John, I thoroughly enjoyed your conversation with James Dice on Nexus a few weeks back. I thought it was a particularly eloquent description, not only of the history, but also how that informs where we go from here. For myself, I am an investor and an advisor focused entirely on the early stage aspects of company building. And for the last 18 months or so, I've been focused specifically on the built space. We could spend the rest of this hour and many hours after talking about challenges and issues that have maybe prevented or slowed adoption in the space. And I'm certainly not one who would say that that's magically going to vanish. Many people would say the built space is a decade or two behind. And maybe they'll still be saying that in a decade, but I don't think they'll be saying it's 3 decades behind. And by that, I mean, the reason I'm spending all my time is I think there's some really important macro trends, specifically the millennial and Gen Y workers that are moving into the workspace and increasingly having heft in decision-making, who don't hear the answer of, well, that's just not how we do things anymore, and say, okay, fine. But there's that pressure. There's an increasing number of quality venture firms focused on the built space. And the reason that's important is, in order to be effective, as you all know, in this sector, you need to do more than just put up a website. And I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but here in Silicon Valley, we're constantly flooded with the stories of Clubhouse going from founding to $1 billion in 12 months, right? And there's a tendency out here, at least, to think, well, I just need to find the next story like that. And if you bring that mindset to the built space, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So the reason that having venture funds that are specifically, and we know the list, there's probably almost a dozen now at this point, both here in the US and also in Europe. But the reason that specific focus makes sense and is important as a catalyst is having board members who understand that they shouldn't just be asking about metrics that are relevant to enterprise software or consumer SaaS, and that it's important to think about the distinct aspects of these sectors. It also caught my ear, the comments earlier about most of the activity being in the software side, and that's certainly true. But I think increasingly there are people, I say this in part self-serving. One of the companies that I've been fortunate to be involved with for about a year is called Passive Logic. And Troy and Jeremy and their team have said it's not enough just to put a software layer on top of the existing infrastructure. We really need to think back to really first principles, and that certainly plays into digital twins as well. I guess as a close, I would say whether it's digital twins or any other buzzwords, ultimately this all comes back to, are we solving a problem in a more effective way? I really, it hit home for me this weekend when I was trying to make a small change to my cable line. I haven't cut the cord yet to my cable TV. And I didn't have exactly the right tool to do the crimping. And I ended up having to go to 3 different hardware stores to find it. But it struck me in light of investing in change that had someone said, hey, I have this saw that's Wi-Fi connected and it's, you know, it has this amazing cloud technology, I would have just said, I'm not interested. That's not solving my problem. So it's ultimately, it's great to talk about the technology, but it ultimately comes back to, are we doing something in a more effective way? And if so, then it'll get adopted. It might not happen tomorrow, but it'll get adopted.
So, Glenn, you mentioned something talking about the importance of data from outside your perspective, your business, right? Is that the way you're sort of looking at digital twin as a way of actually getting more data? Is that what you were referring to?
Really just commenting in general on the way people think about sharing data and you know, whatever the historic behaviors associated with wanting to control my own destiny in some kind of command and control manner. You know, if I become more reliant on other people's data to augment mine or extend mine or amplify my value in the, you know, I mean, a digital twin's probably as good an example as anybody could come up with. I mean, the systemic value of it should be very, very high. It's just a question of how easy is it to get everybody to agree on the sort of the kind of conceptual terms and conditions by which all this would get shared. And so, you know, I mean, we've obviously talked about this before. Even before you get to that, you got to figure out how to connect all this stuff and integrate it. And, you know, many of the same hurdles that we faced in different contexts in history are present in this story, on top of which, you know, essentially more sophisticated modeling and virtual capture of system values and being able to make that something that can be accessed and leveraged across a community of vendors is to me more of a behavior thing than a technology thing. And so if you know, so I've used this joke forever, but if I called the IT world the overworld and I called the OT world the underworld, the underworld doesn't get the we share because we care, or we share because we think there's leverage in it, you know. So in many respects, I think behavior will be the first major hurdle to this. But you know, again, it may be in mission critical applications and segments where this takes hold first, and once those values are really demonstrated, then I think people will come to understand that collaborating on data and leveraging data use in a collaborative manner across multi-vendor systems has many advantages. They're just not necessarily culturally aligned with the way we've thought about this in the past.
Open it up to the group.
I have a question, Glenn and Scott. You both kind of alluded to the fact that you know, our adoption of the technology is, you know, lagging significantly, 10 years or even more, a couple of decades. I mean, what do you think is the one? I mean, I think that the things that might drag it along, kicking and screaming, are the change from, you know, from the baby boomers to the millennials and people investing and M&A a lot quicker. But what do you think is the one major roadblock for the industry not to actually really accelerate into adopting technology quicker? And is it contractual, or is it the software itself? What is it, do you think?
I'll take a swing at it, Glenn. This may be oversimplistic, but I don't think it's had to. I think that up until, and this is another dynamic that's obviously only hit in the last year, but you never, as a building owner of commercial real estate in particular, let's think about, you know, big metro areas just to start with. You never really had to even ask the question, much less answer, why do people have to come into our building to do work? it sounds like an overly simplistic question, but we've all just come through 12 months of more or less getting stuff done at home, right? And in some cases, more efficiently and effectively. And so I wonder if as people return to the office, there's going to be more of an emphasis on, boy, you know what? I could have done this a whole lot easier and more efficiently at home on Thursday and Friday of last week. And I come into the office and it ends up being, there end up being a lot of hurdles. Even once I get to the office, everyone talks about the commute, but once I get to the office, so, you know, whether that changes or not, I don't have a crystal ball, but it certainly seems like that's one of the things that could be a catalyst to make a change for going forward versus before 2019.
I think my answer would be, well, I would just say maybe pre-COVID, my answer would have been, you know, the building equipment space. I mean, you know, all of the original originating data that would feed all these systems. So, you know, power distribution or HVAC or light, whatever. I mean, all of these businesses still largely make all of their money on selling the thing, and the margin on the thing, and the product P&L reigns supreme, and the aftermarket parts P&L reigns even more supreme. But it's not like, you know, we've moved yippee skippy into SaaS and software models where all these equipment guys are making tons of money and huge margins in a SaaS-like way. And so I think in many respects, the enablers of the economics of this has been as much an inhibitor as anything.
So I have a question for you guys. And the question is, we've talked a lot about digital twin, and is it a technology play? Is it a business play? Is it a combination of both? Whatever, there's still some debate. But my question from you guys, your thoughts is, who owns the twin? We're still debating on who owns the data. Is it, so from y'all's perspective, in your opinion, who owns the twin? Is it the system integrator or master system integrator? Is it the building owner? Is it a equipment manufacturer that has a twin, as you know, or so forth and so on?
Oof.
Caught you speechless. Oh yeah, I gotcha. No,
Okay, all right, Mark.
I don't know if I'll answer it, but I'll ask a question that extends from that, which is, how does that influence? And I think it's going to be different in different markets, but I mean, the answer that you give to that question, which is the key question, is going to influence how much information you get out of the digital twin models, right? Is it the owner? If the owner insists on owning the data, then they can do a lot more with it. But that may be a bit of a bridge too far. If it's the integrator, how much tangible, how much sharing of information are they going to be willing to do? And certainly at the OEM level, you know, we know how that's worked. Let's hope the market doesn't go in that direction.
Right.
I mean, I would argue the technology is mature enough to have, you know, lots of compound information and data available about multiple vendor systems in an integrated fashion with, you know, pretty sophisticated permissioning and access and identity management enablement. So, you know, whether it's the owner or a proxy for the owner, an integrator or otherwise, you know, we are at a point where I think the technology is certainly able to enable, you know, lots of control and means of access and so forth. And depending on the roles that different constituents play in this, those kinds of tools can go quite some distance in making this relatively secure in the context of what people fear. It's just kind of a question of, I mean, I look back at the Haystack folks and say, you know, where is that data ownership story these days in the building systems world?
So if I could add to that, Glenn and Scott, I have a comment and a question. You know, to me, the data is owned by whoever originates the data. So that should be pretty clear, I think, with the building owner, my opinion. The other question I have for you is, since, and if you've addressed this somewhere else, I apologize for that. But my question is, since you both said I think Scott, you said, that the solution or the product is pretty mature. So when you both are evaluating and then looking at different solutions or companies as far as the products and services that they offer, what criteria do you use to determine if, yes, that product is that product, and yes, it does work? And how do you compare that between other products of different providers?
Good and tough
Glenn,
question.
you want, okay. So it's a bit of, because I'm operating at a fairly early stage level, I don't necessarily have access to, reams of interviews or, hey, let's talk to 100 different owners to find out what their perspective is on this. To me, I'm always looking, one of the most important things in this sector is to find entrepreneurs who, sure, they're good at the technology piece, but that's only table stakes. What's far more important is them demonstrating a passion for and an understanding of the specific sales dynamics in their sector. I mentioned Passive Logic before. One of the things that Troy said to me early on was, he said, look, what we're developing is sexy in some respects, and it gets a lot of attention in boardrooms, but it wasn't until we started talking to the boiler room also that we started seeing traction and real sales interest. And I think a similar type of mindset, to me, if you don't have that, you're just you're in the wrong sector. This is not a field of dreams. Build it and they will come. And so have you really given some thought, either because you come from the industry or because you're passionate about it, to why people will spend money on whatever it is, whether it's software or hardware?
I think a question for Scott, seeing you have your perspective on the investment side and connection with VCs and stuff, and just one of the things we keep coming up with is kind of the conflict between our, we can call it slow moving, but I think it's more complicated than that. There are valid reasons that the built environment takes time to adopt things, and the mindset of who's got the latest app, Clubhouse or whatever. Do you believe that investors are open to solutions that, number one, don't own the data, right? And number two, aren't sold exclusively as software as a service? Because I can relate in conversations I've had just with these people that, if you say to them, you're not software as a service, our company isn't, they can't leave the room fast enough. Okay. Right. But you don't have permanent hooks into these people? Oh, what are you, stupid? I'm out of here. Who's this moron? Right. And there's arguments for software as a service and against it. The point I want to make is there are realities in the market that you're not going to flip a switch and everybody is going to do everything in a building as software as a service. What do you hear from the understanding of any of the investors you talk to?
Yeah, you cut out there, at least on my end, John, for a bit, but I think I got the gist of the question, which is, if you're not a SaaS, if you're not building a SaaS business model or a company with a SaaS business model, how can you get traction and how can you get interest from the investment community, given that there seems to be allergies, significant allergy across the sector to anything that isn't SaaS or SaaS derivative? And I think the answer to that is there's not a good one, but what might be helping in that, at least in moving that forward, is
Whoop.
Oops.
Scott just froze.
that understand some of the dynamics. Now, that doesn't mean.
Scott, you froze when you said the answer is, which is the most frustrating.
the hand of the Meta investment community just came down.
That's it.
It's like tune into next week's episode and we'll tell you. Yeah.
SaaS forever or we all die.
I think it's frozen again.
I think you better maybe log off and log back in.
This is like who shot JR? We got to wait, you know?
Wait for next week.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll just make a comment. I mean, as AI and machine learning are, continuing to mature and become more substantial in any of these contexts and any markets, what I've seen from investors is that they're developing a paranoia about it, because the number of data scientists required to go model things makes the business look more like an integration business than a SaaS business model. And so they're all worried that their SaaS model is going to get kind of tainted by data science. And so if there is a herd effect in the investor community, I for one believe that they're pretty two-dimensional. They stay on the rail, and that rail lasts a while, and we're still suffering through that. And so variations on that are hard to find that you can get mainstream investors or institutional investors to find interesting. It's just my back-ass way of agreeing with John.
Glenn,
Sorry,
in
go
the
ahead.
past couple of weeks, we've been trying to better define what everybody means by digital twin. And we had 3 suppliers on most recently and asked them about it. And the sort of the takeaway I took, at least, was that what we're doing, building automation, is an example of digital twin, because we're modeling, right, how a building runs from a control standpoint. So any of the automation work could be argued to be an example of digital twin.
Sure.
Couple of the companies were focused on, the taking BIM and converting that into something that could be added into the picture. They made the argument that not a lot of it is actually being done in practice from a real-time perspective. But I think we talked about the phrase digital twin versus digital transformation.
Yep.
And one guy made a very compelling argument that digital twin is really a better way to describe what we do, and we should get behind it and try to make it more real for people. What do you think?
I agree with that. I mean, I agree with your last statement, because it implies a reasonably well-bounded set of technologies in order to realize that kind of value, which aren't too difficult to explain to people, I think, that have any sort of technical context at all. Transformation is just a runaway train kind of term that I find, whatever. It's the meta term that all this lives within.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So,
and
so argument was made. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, in other words, I've used CAD models and finite element models and all sorts of things that people have been accustomed to for a long time to explain the underlying underpinnings of, the nature of the technology that can inform and enable digital twins. And I think in that more bounded context, it's a lot easier to explain. And I honestly believe eventually this could be a pretty interesting service business in and of itself if we get past John's point about SaaS being kind of this huge inhibitor from an institutional investor standpoint. It's sort of like the property management services sector could do a lot to drive this further forward if their economic model were aligned with this, which it probably isn't very well aligned.
So I think the second point that was made, which I think really makes a whole lot of sense, is we're not going to change. I don't think no one's going to change the industry such that the siloed nature of lighting versus power management versus HVAC and so on is going to be suddenly done by one company or one integrator. You're going to have specialization and continue to have specialization. And if each aspect creates a twin, if you will, a digital twin of whatever it's doing, the hardware that's in the building, the lights, the motors, the fans and so on, then we really need a way to make that data easily accessible. So it can be, so basically you're building the digital twin building, right? By saying, here's my lights, here's my HVAC, here's my parking system and so on. And I've constructed this digital twin from different vendors, but they all play nicely together. And that's going to, I think, is going to be the key to making this work, is that you can create and build the digital twin from a variety of, suppliers and sources in a common methodology. It's something Anto in particular has been working on. And I just want, again, to get your thoughts on how important that will be if we're really going to realize this.
It's central. There's no other way to get around it. And so whether you try to connect things all the way up to trying to simulate and optimize things, you still have to have, in other words, an easier, maybe a different way of looking at this. If you just look at the evolution of data management tools in the enterprise and IT space, that whole world has pretty deliberately taken lots of steps to get itself to a fairly converged state of tools that people need in order to go apply all these technologies. And so, I mean, it really just goes back to, I think there's a certain inevitability that, like I said at the beginning, that we'll get here, and just we could all debate the timing of that. I think we're blue in the face, but yes, you'll need a common methodology, and the underlying elements of that are probably as important as anything is just the data management and transformation standards for all these different types of equipment have to come together in some. It's a little bit like when drafting, invaded the architectural space. You could do things quite miraculously, and it didn't take very long for standards to take hold there to drive that technology. Whenever the tipping point occurs here, I think you'll find that most of those tools are mature enough to help move that process along. It's more a question of getting past this behavioral investment sort of set of hurdles.
Steve, do you think that's part of what the MSI roles evolve into? Because the chiller already has 400 items of data, the lighting system has data, and the MSI's role is almost working on behalf of the customer, be it a REIT or someone else, and they are getting smarter and saying, hey, I need someone like an MSI that sits between me and everyone else to make sure I get this information delivered properly. And he does that kind of integration at IT/OT level as well. I'm just wondering whether that's the evolving role of the MSI too.
Yeah. Yes.
So Scott is back with us. Welcome back, Scott.
Yeah, Anto, I guess apologies on behalf of Comcast. Apparently,
you were cutting the wrong cord.
Why do we need to be back in the office?
You shouldn't
I
be
think
talking.
you were cutting the wrong cord.
That chainsaw you bought, where'd you cut the cable?
So maybe John, can you just sort of re-ask that question sort of briefly, and so we can go back to that because it was an important point. You're muted.
More concisely, you mean?
Yes.
The question was, what do you sense is the appetite for investors when a business isn't purely SaaS, right? I think we touched on a little bit of that with the hardware. And for companies who are going to provide, benefits of analytics, but aren't going to own the data, right?
Yeah. So on the hardware side, it's certainly true that it's a tough climb. I've at the risk of mentioning Passive Logic again, they had a challenging time despite the really interesting technology that they were developing. However, they did get a $16.16 million Series A round done eventually, where they found investors who understood the power of going to the hardware layer. Now, that's a perhaps rare example, and I think the more encouraging potential dynamic is that there are investment groups now focused on these spaces that aren't necessarily going to say we're happy funding anything that's hardware related, but they will understand how the markets work and the fact that they need to take a closer look. Now, in terms of the if you don't own the data, can you generate significant value? I was talking to a company last week that has done a couple of, they've done their seed and are in the middle of doing their A right now, with a couple of the firms that I alluded to before, who they don't own the data, but because of a couple of different things related to how they're manipulating it, they're able to generate information that's proving to be valuable to the operational side of certain buildings. So there's no magic, on either side, and it's a whole lot easier out here in Silicon Valley and more broadly to get funding with a consumer SaaS play or an enterprise software play. But increasingly, I think people are understanding that there's a significant opportunity to innovate in these sectors in a way that people outside of the sectors, people who aren't on this call, hadn't really appreciated before.
So here's a question way out of left field, completely out there. Could it be possible to create a digital twin at the hardware level, or group digital twins, different pieces of a building system? Let's say HVAC lighting, create a digital twin off of one very powerful controller or whatever. And is that a way around this? And then, yes, have it at that device level, and then utilize, let's say, a cloud environment for some of that, or to house or store massive amount of data from the twins at the device level. Now, this is twice I've gotten everybody speechless here,
Yeah, Mark, I always played shortstop in baseball, so I'm not good in left field or even like far out. So I'm just gonna sit this one
good
out.
answer, Scott. Good answer.
I mean, I would argue that data services, data brokering, data repositories, whatever, open data interactions. I mean, all of these things could be a whole layer of enablement, where again, you can, anonymize things. You can organize access and utilization of that data in ways that are different than any one dominant, quote, owner or controller of said data. And those models, I think, have the potential to migrate into this space in any number of segments.
Mark, there's no logical reason why it shouldn't. You got analytics and AI at all levels. Why shouldn't there be similarly, digital twins at different levels?
Yeah,
we got.
I was going to say one of the it's people often talk in the binary about, are you a cloud solution or are you an edge solution? And I think the reality is that the winners are going to are going to take the best of both. Even on the AI side, the machine learning side, NVIDIA has and others as well are releasing product that can do some of the processing for specific things at the edge. And then in other cases, it'll make sense to pull it up to the cloud. But that's one of the potential benefits for the building world, the built tech, right? Is that we're in a place now where it's not just either or, it's not just a cloud or edge, but increasingly, I think it can be both.
Well, there's lots of interesting simulation tools coming out of the backfield. Say the data sets that I need don't necessarily all have to originate from original equipment, that there's ways to build data sets that can circumvent some of that too. So again, I think there's a certain inevitability that this will eventually align itself and will occur. I just think, it does need a kind of a persona sitting in the middle of it, wanting to do it and motivated to do it in a way that helps facilitate.
Glenn and Scott, just out of interest in your experience, is there any one vertical market that's moving ahead or looking at digital twins better, like, you know, retail versus REIT versus education, hospitals?
That's a pretty hard question to answer. I would argue that many of the characteristics that are inherent here with you know, hospital chains and healthcare delivery chains is a good example of a place where I think the stars are better aligned than other places to try and imagine getting past first base on this. But mission criticality in general is I think a huge instigator and always has been. I mean, because you can go find all the same equipment in places like biopharma manufacturing, where people are just dealing in facility related and HVAC related, you know, cooling towers, all this stuff, where they're optimizing the hell out of that stuff and using digital twins and so forth. So there's also, you know, the nature of migration of those systems into other segments. I think that will contribute to this over time as well.
Aerospace is a good.
Yeah, I was going to say we're, at least from what I've seen, it's driven less by sector and more by, we're so early in the adoption of technology like this that it's driven more by organizations that have resources. So, you know, big tech companies and or visionaries on the either the operations or technology side. And those people could be scattered across different sectors, right? How it evolves over time, I think certainly some of the more mission critical sectors are more likely to adopt it sooner than others. Healthcare being a good example.
So we're coming to the last sort of 8 minutes, 7 minutes or so. Wondering if we can sort of get to how should we behave differently in this industry? How we, the group on screen and also the audience, given that we now have this thing called digital twin that we know a little bit more than we did a month ago, how do you think we should behave differently? Should we all of a sudden say that we're a digital twin industry, or should we ignore it? Should we?
Oh, I think there's an inherent value because the multi-vendor integration theme. In other words, if one continues to highlight the value that can come from these kinds of systems, then it's pushing, you know, essentially all the right, whatever sequence of buttons and priorities, way people think about this. And, you know, eventually stuff changes. I'm still curious, what would the Haystack community say to all this today?
Haystack enables you to put the data together to support these types of applications, including digital twins. It's one of the, in the conversations we have, it's one of the major barriers that people have to assembling all the data, because by definition, a digital twin is going to pull together data from different systems that don't have a uniform metadata standard, that may have terrible or no metadata at all. So it's part of getting to a digitized future. And so, sorry, I had to do that.
It's okay. Transform me, baby.
And then also for a digital twin to be successful, the data, to John's point, has to be interoperable. And unless you have standards like a Haystack or whatever, you're not going to get to that point where that data is going to be interoperable.
Right.
Yeah, digital silos are not going to help out. That's for sure. Creation of that. You know, just one thought from the startup side. One thing I'd be wary of is just branding. If you're thinking about starting a company, is branding yourself as, hey, we're a digital twins company. It's fine to talk about that again as a tool. We're leveraging digital twin technology or approaches coming out of the digital twins world. But anytime that there's a new technology and it seems hot, it quickly gets labeled as such. You know, there's the joke in Silicon Valley now is that If it's written in PowerPoint, it's AI. And if it's written in Python, it's deep learning, right? The point being that everyone has been calling themselves an AI company, regardless of whether they're actually using machine learning and deep learning to solve problems. So I'd always default back to, here's what this new technology or new type of solution can do, again, in terms of solving a problem.
I would echo that, just in the sense that, however you position the value of these systems, that there are multiple parallel tool sets required in order to realize these systems. And this isn't necessarily something that's all neatly organized in a single company format as much as it's a set of cooperative technologies and behaviors. But I think it's a lot less abstract than autonomous, which is the word we were debating when I was with you all last.
Mm-hmm. So the rest of the group, your thoughts about how we should behave differently? John shaking his head.
I was kind of looking for the right language or positioning to use to help move this into our world a little bit faster and more universally, right? I think we kind of touched on it a little bit at the end there, but I think with anything like this, where it's conceptually kind of a new thing for this industry in particular, the more people that hear it from us, the more often they hear it, the better we're going to be on that. And maybe collectively as a group, learning what your elevator pitch is for digital twin to the rest of the world is really an important thing for all of us to master here.
It's a little bit like the sub tagline. If I say digital twin, but right below it, it says, multi-vendor system optimization, right away you added some whether those are the right words or not, but you've added some context about the level of interplay and complexity of the parts that equal this.
Yeah, I think it's the embracement of it, right? I think our industry, we fought the IoT story for a long time to our detriment, right? And the IoT guys were successful doing what they're doing. And I think, this is a new space, a new place. And like Glenn says, there's a way to encapsulate that and put context to it.
How many incarnations does C3 IoT go through before it got to where it is?
Right.
I always remind people that there's at least 4 chapters to that story.
Okay, so we're at the top of the hour. Any sort of final closing words, Glenn, Scott, before we close up?
I think this will become more and more pragmatic. I wouldn't hesitate utilizing it. I just make sure I find the right context to set it in. So it's it's not this, don't make it the abrupt new thing just because it's fun to have a new thing.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that. And I thank you all for having me. This is a robust discussion that's has a long way to go. But I think if we look at it from the perspective of the stakeholders, ultimately, who are making decisions and trying to extract value from it, and look at it from that perspective, as opposed to, hey, isn't this a cool technology? It's fine to be cool, but it's more important to be a useful tool.
I think those are
That's very fair.
wise words to end the show. Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, Glenn. And as I mentioned earlier, our focus for next week is the new market realities. And I think we basically just sort of outlined some of that just now on this show. So thank you all. Thank you, everybody. And thanks all everybody in the audience. And video of this will be up on YouTube tomorrow. With that, bid you farewell. Have a great week and see you next week. Bye-bye all.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.